like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me here. My name is Brian Bott. I'm a principal scientist at Sage Bionetworks, and I was asked to come and talk briefly about our experiences enabling communities of researchers to work together across institutional boundaries. But really what's at the core of this is the concept of decentralization. And this definition of decentralization comes from one of the shining examples of decentralization, which is Wikipedia. Decentralization is the process of redistributing, dispersing functions, powers, people, or things away from a central location or authority. And so in typical research, biomedical research, oftentimes research was carried out within silos, within institutional silos, and that was done for a very specific reason. You had to recruit people into a physical location where you would generate data about those individuals, and because the data resided there, that is also where the analysis was done. But with a number of technological as well as social advancements, we no longer have to think about all of those functions occurring in the same place or by the same people. We can start thinking about these different modes of operation as, in fact, distinct things. You may be very good at generating high quality data, but you may not be the best person to analyze that. And vice versa, you may be an analytically brilliant individual, but you may not have the chops to necessarily generate the interesting data. And so a little bit about Sage Bionetworks. We are a nonprofit. We're in Seattle, Washington, about 45, 50 people. And our approach is to promote open systems, incentives, and norms to redefine how complex biological data is gathered, shared, and used. And if you think about sort of the decentralization model there, gathered is sort of recruitment, shared is how you disseminate that, and used is the analytics at the tail end. And so we pilot a number of these systems, incentives, and norms, and we build infrastructure on top of the ones that work and make that available to the community. And then we support a number of research communities that operate under those principles. And here's a little schematic of some of the networks of projects that have started to emerge. And actually, you know, following off of the previous speakers, each one of these connections here in between each one of the circles, there is an individual that is common between those two projects, essentially the person who is helping to disseminate the practices of how these different groups are working. And so we have seen networks evolve in computational oncology, in neurosystems biology. We run a number of analytical challenges, and then most recently, we've been going directly to individuals to help phenotype the population through mobile health apps. And to set the stage here for engaging participants in the research process, there was this really interesting project called the Health Data Exploration Project, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And people were surveyed to ask who they share their PhD with. And PhD in this crowd means something a little bit different. In this case, that meant personal health data. And so people that were collecting data through their mobile devices, through their sensors, and who were they sharing it with? Well, they were sharing it with their friends, their spouses, some with healthcare professionals, and nowhere on this graph is researchers at all. But people were also asked, would you be willing to share your PhD with researchers? And over 75% of people said they either probably would or definitely would. And to be honest, even as somebody who consider myself a champion of sharing, I probably would have answered unsure or it depends in this case. So that really underscores the desire for people to really contribute to research. But right alongside that, people were also asked how important it is for that personal health data to be kept anonymous, and almost 95% of people said it was at least somewhat important. And so we have this balance we have to consider, but I would posit that too often data sharing is an afterthought for researchers, and it's bolted on after the fact. And so if instead we treat it as a design problem, something that we want to embed in our research from the beginning. This is a paper that a couple of colleagues of mine, John Wilbanks and Stephen Friend, published in Nature Biotechnology this last year, where we talk about a framework that accounts for two things. One, the choices that the trial participant makes about how they want their data shared, but also how we qualify researchers who wish to access and use that information at the tail end. And so I'm going to touch just briefly on a use case, a feasibility study that we launched in March of 2015 through Apple's Research Kit, the MPower study, which is a feasibility study in Parkinson's disease. As part of the consent process, we actually gave people the option of if they wanted to share their research data only with Sage Bionetworks, or if they wanted to share it with Sage and any other qualified researcher worldwide. And very, very similar to the Robert Wood Johnson Health Data Exploration Project, over 75% of people agreed to share their data more broadly. And so part of what was done in this study, the mobile phone has sensors embedded into it that are very, very ripe for helping to quantify certain symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Symptoms like bradykinesia, issues with gait, and then hypophonia. And so we developed a qualified researcher process by which people can go register for an account within our data sharing platform. They have to validate that they are who they say they are, so they just have to say, hey, I'm Brian Bott at Sage Bionetworks. They have to show that they have some basic understanding of sharing of human data, and then they have to submit an intended data use statement that we make public so that people can know what's being done with their data. And really, this is an attempt to promote an ecosystem where research is conducted for others to consume as opposed to just for an individual. So the first 6 months of this data we made publicly available a year after the study started. So we hadn't published any analysis on this. There were over 9,000 unique participants, over 1,000 of which had Parkinson's disease, almost 200,000 of those activities with fine-grained sensor readouts included on it. And in the last year, we've had over 100 independent qualified researchers come and access this data to do a whole myriad of different things. And so this is academic groups from all across the country, all across the world, in fact, disease foundations, pharmaceutical industry, Apple's competitors Verily at Google. So really a broad set of people who now have access to that. And actually launching this summer, we're going to be taking that initial data that we made publicly available, using it as a training set, and using the subsequent data that we've collected as validation for an analytical challenge for feature extraction. So really trying to galvanize that community. And so just with the last couple of minutes here, I want to touch on a few high-level themes, and I could spend 10 minutes talking about each one of these. So please come find me afterwards if you're interested in any of these specific things. So the reason we're seeing an increased decentralized research ecosystem is a pushing for greater transparency, technology development that is moving really, really fast that's upending traditional models of research, regulatory aspects that are lagging and are rooted in an outdated system, and a number of social aspects that are often the largest barriers to moving the field forward. And Sage has sort of two main bits to our approach of how we support these groups. One is we have open as a guiding principle, but we don't have it as a dogmatic conviction. And two, we leverage the cloud as our native solution, but again, not as our only option. And one thing that we've found is that the cloud actually disrupts this ecosystem in really interesting ways. So open source code used to be a way to disseminate algorithms and software. And now, instead of users downloading that locally, everything is provided to them as a service. So users interact directly with these software platforms. So think about how often you use Google Drive as opposed to Microsoft Word, for instance. And these are stacks on stacks on stacks that are built on top of one another. And users are expecting it to work 24 hours a day and work on every device. And so as we think about building out infrastructure as part of GP Write, I think we need to be really cognizant of some of these issues. And on top of that, additionally, classical funding mechanisms, in particular granting mechanisms, are currently ill-equipped to support these efforts. So it requires forethought with respect to sustainability, especially when data is not a commodity. A lot of software as a service uses data as its commodity, and also when you're not selling clicks or ads. So with that, I'll say thanks and take any questions.
So could you clarify what you mean by funding granting mechanisms not being well equipped to deal with this? Are you talking about the long-term nature of the services?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it used to be the case where you could fund somebody to do something in isolation, produce a product, and then that product could be given away. But when you operate things as a service, that's something that you have to continually sustain over time.
And do you have ideas about how that could be addressed?
Absolutely, there are some ways, and I think it will require funding agencies to rethink the way that they support infrastructure. And so the way a lot of these services operate is they charge a nominal fee for an extended period, a period of time for access. And so instead of funding a group to build something new, you could consider building into the granting mechanism a way for which they could pay for services that are being provided by external groups. All right, thanks.